The morning sun hadn't yet burned through the Virginia mist when Lieutenant Kira Ashford woke to the sound of a drill sergeant's whistle cutting through the barracks. She opened her eyes slowly, carefully, the way she'd trained herself to do for the past 9 months. No sudden movements, no signs of the warrior beneath the uniform. Around her, 23 other women stirred in their bunks, groaning and cursing the early hour. Kira sat up with the same sluggish resistance, rubbing her eyes like she'd barely slept. In truth, she'd been awake for 40 minutes already, lying motionless in the dark, running through her mental checklist the way she did every morning. Day 273, Fort Carlisle, Virginia. Mission status ongoing. Cover identity intact. She was Private Kira Hayes, 22 years old on paper. Fresh out of basic training. Quiet. Forgettable. The kind of soldier who blended into formations and disappeared in crowds. The kind nobody looked at twice. That was exactly the point. Kira swung her legs off the thin mattress and placed her boots on the cold concrete floor. Her body moved with the practiced clumsiness of exhaustion, but inside every muscle remembered a different kind of training. The kind that happened in unmarked buildings with instructors who had no names and missions that didn't exist on any official record. She was Intelligence Support Activity. ISA, the activity. The unit that didn't show up on organization charts or wear identifiable patches. The ghosts who walked among the regular army, watching, listening, learning secrets that never made it into reports. For 9 months she had been a ghost at Fort Carlisle, and in 13 hours that would all change. The other women dressed around her, their movements automatic after months of routine. Kira pulled on her ACU pants, laced her boots with fingers that moved just slowly enough to seem unremarkable. Her auburn hair went up in a regulation bun, secured with bobby pins that looked ordinary, but weren't. One held a micro SD card, another concealed a tracker beacon so small it could fit under a fingernail. But she wouldn't need them today. Today the mission ended. She just didn't know it yet. The physical training grounds were already crowded when Kira's platoon arrived, boots crunching on gravel, still wet with dew. Soldiers stretched in loose clusters, their breath forming small clouds in the cool morning air. Somewhere across the field, a cadence call echoed rhythmic and sharp. Kira took her usual position at the back of the formation. Not too far back that it looked intentional, but far enough that she could observe without being observed. It was a skill she'd perfected over 273 days. The art of being present without being seen. Staff Sergeant Thorne Brennan stood at the front of the formation, clipboard in hand, his broad shoulders squared against the dawn. He was 35 years old and looked older, with lines carved deep around his eyes and a jaw that seemed permanently clenched. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. The kind of service record that spoke of things seen and things done that couldn't be unseen or undone. Kira had memorized every detail of his file before she'd ever set foot on this base. She knew he'd lost his younger brother, Private Declan Brennan, in an ambush outside Kandahar in 2012. She knew he'd been flagged for anger management issues 3 times in the past 18 months. She knew he woke up at 0347 every morning, 17 minutes before his alarm, because his body still remembered the time the mortar started falling in Helmand Province. She knew all of this because watching him had been part of her mission. For 9 months, Kira had observed Thorne Brennan with the kind of attention most people reserve for immediate threats. Not because he was dangerous, though he could be, but because someone in Washington had flagged him as a potential recruitment target for foreign intelligence. A vulnerable soldier, isolated, angry, dealing with trauma that the system had failed to address properly. Someone had decided he might be willing to betray his country for the promise of money or purpose or revenge. They'd been wrong. Kira had known it within the first month, but intelligence work didn't run on intuition. It ran on documentation. Evidence, patterns of behavior recorded and analyzed until probability became certainty. So she'd watched for 273 days, compiling a dossier that proved what she'd known from the beginning. Thorne Brennan wasn't a traitor. He was just broken, and the army had left him that way. All right, listen up. Thorne's voice cut through the morning chatter, flat and mechanical. 5-mile run, standard pace. Anyone falls out, you're doing it again this afternoon in full gear. Questions. No one asked questions. They'd learned not to. The formation broke and reformed into a running column, soldiers settling into their positions with the ease of repetition. Kira found her place in the middle of the pack, neither fast enough to stand out nor slow enough to draw attention. She ran the way she did everything else here. Adequately, unremarkably, like someone who was doing her best but would never be exceptional. It was harder than any mission she'd ever run. The real Kira Ashford could run 5 miles in under 32 minutes with a 40-pound ruck on her back. She'd done it in the mountains of Colorado during ISA selection, where the instructors pushed candidates until they broke or transcended. She'd learned to move through forests without disturbing the undergrowth, to navigate by stars alone, to remember 47 faces after seeing each one for less than 3 seconds. But Private Kira Hayes ran at an 8-minute mile pace and looked tired doing it. The column moved through the base boots, striking pavement in an uneven rhythm. Kira kept her breathing steady, her form deliberately imperfect. Around her, other soldiers talked between breaths, fragments of conversation about weekend plans and duty assignments, and the new supply sergeant, who allegedly had a tattoo of a dragon wrapped around her entire torso. Kira listened to all of it, remembered all of it, not because it mattered to the mission, but because that's what she did. She collected people the way others collected stamps or coins, every name, every story, every small detail that made them human rather than just bodies in uniform. In 9 months, she'd learned the names of 340 soldiers on this base. She knew their hometowns and their siblings' names and which ones called their mothers every Sunday night. She knew who was struggling with money and who was having an affair and who'd gotten a DUI that somehow never made it into their official record. She knew them better than they knew themselves. And after today, she'd walk away from all of them without looking back. That was the job. The formation rounded a corner near the motor pool, and Kira caught a glimpse of something that made her internal radar ping. A black SUV with government plates parked in the visitor section. Windows tinted dark enough to be illegal in most states. A small detail most people would overlook. But Kira wasn't most people. That was Colonel Garrison's vehicle, which meant he was on base, which meant something had changed. Her heart rate increased, though her breathing stayed steady. She forced her attention back to the run to the soldier in front of her, whose name was Kendra Martinez, and who was planning to propose to her girlfriend next month in Savannah. Normal thoughts, normal observations, but a cold knot of anticipation had settled in her chest. After 9 months of waiting, something was about to happen. The mess hall at Fort Carlisle had been built in the 1960s and looked it. Long steel tables arranged in rigid rows, high windows that let in light but never quite enough, floors that had been mopped 10,000 times and still somehow carried the ghost of every meal ever served within these walls. Kira pushed through the double doors at 12:07 hours, her uniform still damp with sweat from the morning run. The hall was already crowded, filled with the ambient roar of 200 conversations happening simultaneously. Trays clattering, chairs scraping. The hiss of steam tables and the sharp smell of industrial-grade disinfectant trying to mask the scent of fried food. She joined the line with the same unhurried pace she brought to everything, picking up a tray that was slightly warmer than it should be, still wet from the wash cycle. Moved down the service line. Meatloaf or chicken, mashed potatoes or rice, green beans that had been cooked until they'd surrendered all will to live. She chose the chicken, the potatoes, the beans, added a roll that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd only heard bread described secondhand. Hayes, the voice came from her left, sharp and impatient. Kira turned. Specialist Marcus Webb, a supply clerk with a gambling problem and a second kid on the way. She'd watched him lose $80 on a football game 2 weeks ago, money he couldn't afford to lose. Yeah, you seen Rodriguez? She was supposed to cover my shift, but she's ghosting my texts. Haven't seen her since morning automation. Damn. He grabbed his tray with more force than necessary. I've got an appointment off base. If she doesn't show, I'm screwed. Kira nodded, the kind of non-committal acknowledgement that invited no further conversation. Webb moved on, already pulling out his phone to send another message into the void. She paid for her meal at the register, offered the tired-looking private working the cash box a small smile that went unreturned, turned to scan the mess hall for a seat. That's when it happened. The bump was small, inevitable in a crowded space. Kira's shoulder caught the edge of a tray just as his owner was turning away from the beverage station. The impact wasn't hard, but it was poorly timed. The tray tilted, A glass of iced tea teetered on the edge and lost its battle with gravity. The glass hit the floor and exploded in a spray of amber liquid and ice cubes, the crash impossibly loud in the cavernous space. Conversations stuttered, heads turned, that universal human instinct to look at disaster no matter how minor. Kira's eyes went to the man whose tray she'd bumped. Staff Sergeant Thorne Brennan. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, voice steady and quiet. "I didn't see you turning." She crouched down, already reaching for the larger shards of broken glass. Around them, the mess hall slowly returned to its normal volume, crisis averted. Just another small accident in a place where small accidents happen daily. But Thorne hadn't moved. He stood frozen, staring down at the puddle of tea spreading across the linoleum. Ice cubes scattered like shrapnel, light catching on broken glass. Kira saw it in his eyes before his body showed it. That fractional change, pupils dilating, jaw muscles tensing. The barely perceptible shift from present to past, from Virginia to Afghanistan, from a spilled drink to blood seeping into desert sand. "Sergeant Brennan," she said carefully, still crouched. "It's okay, just tea." His hand moved before the words registered. A strike to her shoulder, not with full force, but with enough to send her stumbling back. Her boots lost purchase on the wet floor. She went down hard hip, hitting the ground, tray clattering away. The mess hall went absolutely silent. 200 soldiers, 200 witnesses. And in the center of it all, Kira Ashford sat on the floor in a puddle of iced tea, looking up at a man whose eyes were still seeing a different war, in a different country, in a different life. She could have moved, should have moved. Her body knew a dozen ways to avoid that strike, 100 ways to respond. 8 years of training screamed at her to act, to defend, to neutralize the threat. Instead, she stayed very still. "Say something." Thorne's voice was rough, raw. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline catching up to the action. "Or can't you speak without orders?" Kira looked at him with eyes that held no fear, no anger. Only a deep, careful understanding that she couldn't possibly explain. She'd spent 9 months learning his patterns. She knew this moment had been coming. Knew it would arrive like a storm that had been building on the horizon, inevitable and terrible. "It's okay," she said quietly. "I understand." Around them, the silence deepened. Someone had pulled out a phone, was probably already recording. This would be all over base by dinner time. Private Hayes, the quiet, nobody getting struck by Staff Sergeant Brennan in front of the entire mess hall. Except that wasn't what had happened. Not really. What had happened was far more complicated and far more simple. A man carrying wounds no one could see had finally broken under weight no one had helped him carry. And Kara had been there when it happened, which meant she was there when everything else was about to happen too. Because she could hear them now. The sound that had been at the edge of her awareness for the past 30 seconds. Boots on pavement. Multiple sets. Moving with a cadence that had nothing to do with regular army formations. A rhythm she knew better than her own heartbeat. The double doors of the mess hall swung open. 5 men entered in a loose formation that looked casual, but wasn't. They wore civilian clothes, jeans and tactical pants, button-down shirts that concealed the exact shape of what they carried underneath. No unit patches, no name tags, nothing that identified them as military, except the way they moved and the way every soldier in the room immediately recognized them as something other, something more. The mess hall's silence transformed. No longer the stunned quiet of witnessing an incident, but the breathless hush of civilians watching lions walk through their neighborhood. Dangerous, inexplicable, magnificent. Kira felt her pulse quicken despite 9 months of practiced calm. She'd known they would come eventually, had been expecting it. But seeing them here now in this moment made it real in a way that 9 months of preparation hadn't. The last man through the door was older than the others, 62 years old with iron gray hair, cut military short, and eyes that had seen more wars than most people could name. He wore a brown leather jacket that looked soft with age boots that had walked on 4 continents. Colonel Everett Garrison, her handler, her mentor. The man who'd recruited her 4 years ago from a pool of candidates so classified even the candidates didn't know they were being considered. His eyes swept the mess hall with professional efficiency, cataloging threats and exits, and the general mood in less than 2 seconds. Then they found her. Sitting on the floor in spilled tea with her shoulder already bruising and her cover identity about to shatter like that glass on the ground. Something passed between them in that look. A question and an answer and an apology, all compressed into a single moment of eye contact. Then Garrison walked forward, his team falling into position around him, with the unconscious coordination of men who'd operated together long enough to move like a single organism. The soldiers in the mess hall parted for them, not because anyone ordered it, but because those 5 men radiated a kind of authority that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with capability. They were the real deal in a room full of people who'd only heard stories. Garrison stopped 3 feet from where Kira sat, close enough that his voice would carry far enough that it looked professional rather than personal. Lieutenant Ashford. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. But in the perfect silence of the mess hall, every syllable might as well have been shouted. You all right? The words hit like artillery. Lieutenant, not private. Lieutenant Ashford. Her real name, her real rank. Kira felt the weight of 200 stares, the pressure of questions being formed in 200 minds. But she kept her eyes on Garrison, kept her face carefully neutral, even as 9 months of careful construction collapsed around her. I'm fine, sir, she said. Not Hayes's uncertain mumble, but Ashford's clear, measured tone. The voice of someone who'd briefed generals and run operations in countries that weren't officially on any map. Behind Garrison, one of the other operators spoke. Master Sergeant Donovan Cross, 45 years old, 20 years in special operations. The kind of soldier who could navigate by stars and strip a rifle blindfolded and still somehow remembered every teammate's birthday. She's not a private, Cross said loud enough for the room to hear. She's ISA, been deep cover here for 9 months. The mess hall exploded, not with sound, but with movement. Soldiers rising from their seats, phones coming out, whispered conversations turning urgent. Someone knocked over a chair in their haste to get a better view. Someone else was definitely recording now, maybe multiple someones. Private Hayes, the nobody, the invisible girl who cleaned latrines and ran at the back of formations and never said anything interesting in any conversation, wasn't Private Hayes at all. She was something else entirely. Thorne Brennan stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions too quickly to catalog. Shock, confusion, horror as realization set in. His hand, the one that had struck her, hung at his side like it belonged to someone else. His voice cracked. Sir, I had no idea who she was. It was just a disciplinary issue, a small incident. But Garrison wasn't looking at him. He was still looking at Kira. And in his eyes, she saw something that made her heart sink. Not anger, not disappointment, regret. Because saying her name out loud in this mess hall hadn't been part of any plan. It had been a mistake, a slip, the kind of error that veterans like Garrison weren't supposed to make. But he'd made it, and now 9 months of work had just evaporated in front of 200 witnesses. Kira climbed to her feet, slowly ignoring the ache in her hip. Her uniform was soaked with tea, her shoulder throbbing where Thorne's hand had connected. But she stood straight, shoulders back, with the kind of posture that had nothing to do with the basic training and everything to do with a different kind of education. Colonel, she said quietly just for him, you just burned 9 months of operation. I know. His jaw tightened. We need to extract you. Now. No. The word came out firmer than she intended. Not yet. Lieutenant, I said not yet. She turned away from him, away from his team with their tactical awareness and their coiled readiness. Turned to face the mess hall full of soldiers who were still processing what they'd just learned. 273 days. That's how long she'd lived among them, how long she'd watched them and learned them and carried their stories in her head like precious cargo. They deserved more than watching her get extracted like a compromised asset. She found Thorne in the crowd, his face pale, his hands still shaking. A man who'd just realized he'd struck a federal agent in front of dozens of witnesses. A man who was probably already calculating how many years in Leavenworth that would cost him. Staff Sergeant Brennan, she said, her voice carrying in the silence. Come here, please. He moved like someone walking to their execution. 3 steps brought him close enough that she could see the whites around his eyes, the rapid pulse in his neck. Up close, he smelled like fear and old sweat, and something underneath that might have been shame. Ma'am, why did you hit me? She cut him off, not with anger, but with genuine curiosity. Tell me what you saw when that glass broke. He blinked, thrown by the question. Behind her, Kira could feel Garrison's tension, his team's readiness to intervene if this went wrong. But she kept her attention on Thorne, waiting. I don't... His throat worked. It wasn't you. I saw... There was this kid in Kandahar. Couldn't have been more than 16. Came around a corner and we both had weapons up, and there was this moment where we were just staring at each other, and then he stopped. Started again. When I heard the glass break, I was back there. I thought, you thought you were in danger. Kira finished for him. Your body reacted before your brain could catch up. Fight or flight, except you've been trained to fight. So that's what you did. That's not an excuse. No, she agreed, it's not. But it's an explanation. And there's a difference. She took a breath, feeling the weight of every eye in the mess hall. This wasn't how intelligence officers operated. They didn't do public speeches, didn't expose themselves, didn't care about the opinions of regular soldiers who would never understand the kind of work that happened in shadows. But 9 months had changed something in her. 9 months of watching people who didn't know they were being watched. 9 months of learning what they cared about and what kept them awake at night and what made them laugh when they thought no one important was listening. They'd become real to her in a way that targets weren't supposed to. My name is Lieutenant Kira Ashford, she said, addressing the room now. I've been on this base for 9 months. In that time, I've scrubbed floors that most of you walked on without looking down. I've served food in this very mess hall. I've cleaned latrines. I've done every job that nobody wants and nobody notices. Silence. Absolute. Breathless. I know 340 names on this base. I know Private Chen is trying to save enough money to bring her mother over from California. I know Specialist Morrison calls his 5-year-old daughter every night at 8 p.m. because that's when she gets home from dance class. I know Sergeant Williams plays guitar in his off time, and he's actually pretty good, even though he thinks nobody's listening. She saw heads turning, soldiers looking at each other with new awareness, recognition spreading through the crowd like ripples in water. For 9 months, I was invisible. That was the mission. Be someone nobody notices, someone nobody remembers. And you know what I learned? She paused, finding Thorne's eyes again. I learned that respect isn't something you take by force. It's something you show by paying attention, by treating people like they matter even when they think they don't, by understanding that everyone you meet is carrying weight you can't see. Her shoulder throbbed where Thorne had hit her, a pain that would fade to a bruise and then to a memory. But she didn't touch it, didn't acknowledge it. Staff Sergeant Brennan, you have served 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. You've led soldiers into combat. You've made decisions under fire that most people can't imagine having to make. You lost your brother in Kandahar on March 17, 2012, and nobody on this base knows that because you've never talked about it. Because the Army taught you to be strong and silent and to deal with your pain alone. His eyes were wet now, openly. 200 soldiers watching him cry, and he couldn't stop it. You hit me today because you're hurting, Kira continued quietly. Because you've been hurting for 12 years and nobody's helped you carry it. That doesn't make it okay. But it makes it human, and understanding the difference between okay and human is what separates good soldiers from good leaders. She stepped closer, close enough that only he could hear her next words. I've watched you for 273 days, Sergeant. I've seen you at your worst, but I've also seen you stay late to help Private Johnson with his land navigation because you knew he'd fail the course without extra instruction. I've seen you cover shifts for soldiers with family emergencies, even though it meant you worked 18 hours straight. I've seen you be better than your pain over and over again. Thorne's face crumpled. His knees buckled slightly, and for a moment Kira thought he might actually fall. But he caught himself straight, and though tears continued to track down his face in front of everyone. That's who you are, she said. Not the man who struck me, the man who keeps showing up even when everything hurts. Behind her, Garrison cleared his throat. Lieutenant Ashford, we need to debrief. She turned to face him, saw the entire SA team standing in formation. 5 men who could infiltrate terrorist cells and conduct direct action raids and disappear entire problems before sunrise. They looked out of place in this mess hall with its cheap tables and industrial lighting. But so did she now. The careful disguise of Private Hayes had been stripped away, leaving Lieutenant Ashford exposed in a place where she no longer belonged. "Yes, sir," she said. "I understand." But before she could take a step, a voice called out from the back of the mess hall. "Wait!" A soldier stood up. Private First Class Jennifer Rhodes, 19 years old, from a small town in Montana where her father still ran the family ranch. Kira had watched her struggle with homesickness for 3 months before finally finding her footing. "You really know all our names?" Jennifer's voice was uncertain. 340 people. 347, Kira corrected gently. The count went up last Tuesday when the new logistics company arrived. Murmurs rippled through the mess hall. Someone else stood up. "You knew about my daughter." "That was Morrison, the specialist with the 5-year-old. I never talked about that here." "You did," Kira said. "Every Thursday during dinner, you'd check your watch at 1955 hours and get this look on your face. Happy and sad at the same time. I asked around, found out why." More soldiers rising now, questions forming. The wall between Private Hayes and Lieutenant Ashford crumbling as people tried to reconcile the invisible nobody with the intelligence officer who'd apparently been cataloging their entire lives. Garrison's hand touched her elbow lightly. "Kira, we need to go." She knew he was right, knew that staying here exposed like this violated every protocol about deep cover operations. When an identity burned, you extract it immediately. No explanations, no goodbyes, just gone like you'd never existed in the first place. But she also knew something that 9 months had taught her, something that wasn't in any ISA manual or doctrine. These people mattered, not as intelligence targets or security threats or classified dossier entries, as humans, as soldiers doing their jobs in a place that didn't always care about them as individuals. And after 9 months of lying to them, she owed them at least a moment of truth. "I need 5 minutes," she told Garrison quietly. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Step back." His team followed his lead, creating space while maintaining awareness. Professional to the end. Kira turned back to the mess hall, to the sea of faces that had been part of her life, even though none of them had known her real name until 10 minutes ago. "I'm sorry," she said simply, "for lying to all of you, for letting you think I was someone I'm not. That's the job. The mission requires deception, but that doesn't make it feel less wrong." "Why?" The question came from somewhere in the middle of the crowd. "Why were you here? What were you looking for?" She couldn't answer that. Classified information stayed classified even when covers were blown. But she could give them something. "I was looking for threats," she said carefully, "but what I found was a community, imperfect, struggling, human. That's not nothing. That matters." The mess hall had become something else now, not a cafeteria where soldiers ate institutional food and complained about their duties, but a space where 200 people were being forced to reconsider what they thought they knew about the woman who'd been invisible among them for 9 months. Thorne still stood nearby, his face a mask of complicated emotions. Kira turned to him one more time. "Staff Sergeant Brennan, what you did today will probably result in an Article 15, maybe worse. That's the consequence of your actions, and you'll have to face it. But I want you to know something." She pitched her voice so the entire mess hall could hear. "I don't think you're a bad soldier. I think you're a good soldier who's been fighting a war nobody can see. And if this incident finally gets you the help you need, the counseling and support you should have received years ago, then maybe something good comes out of it after all." His mouth moved, trying to form words. Failed. Tried again. "I don't deserve," he managed finally. "You shouldn't. Why would you?" "Because someone has to break the cycle," Kira said simply. "Someone has to look at a soldier who's struggling and choose compassion over punishment, understanding over judgment. That's what I learned here. That's what 9 months of watching all of you taught me." She looked around the mess hall one last time, memorizing faces she'd already memorized, names she'd never forget even though the mission was over. "You're good people," she said. "Not perfect, but good. That's worth protecting. That's worth fighting for. Even when it means fighting for your right to be human and flawed and still valuable." Garrison's hand on her shoulder now firmer. The mission was over. The extraction was happening. Whatever came next would happen somewhere else with different people under different names. But this moment here in this mess hall with weak sunlight streaming through high windows and the smell of institutional food and 200 soldiers who'd just learned that the nobody among them was actually somebody, this moment was real. Take care of each other, Kira said her last words to them. That's the mission that never ends. That's the duty that outlasts every deployment and every war. Take care of each other. She turned and walked toward the double doors, Garrison and his team falling into formation around her. Professional, efficient, already shifting into extraction protocol. Behind her, the mess hall remained silent for 3 more seconds. Then someone started clapping. Kira didn't look back. Couldn't afford to. But she heard it. One person clapping, then another, then a dozen, then the entire mess hall erupting in applause that followed her out the door and into the Virginia afternoon where a black SUV with government plates was already waiting with the engine running. The door closed behind her, muffling the sound, but not erasing it. Some things once heard stayed with you forever, even in silence. The briefing room at Fort Carlisle's intelligence compound was built like a vault. Concrete walls 2 feet thick, windows that were bulletproof and screened against electronic surveillance. A table that could seat 12 but currently held only 4. Kira sat across from Brigadier General Sarah Vance, the base commander, whose silver hair and measuring eyes suggested someone who'd fought battles in boardrooms as often as battlefields. To Kira's left, Colonel Garrison maintained the kind of stillness that came from decades of waiting in hostile territory. Master Sergeant Cross stood by the door, not quite at attention but ready. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, 20. Vance was reading something on a tablet, her expression unreadable. Finally, she set the device down and looked directly at Kira. That was quite a performance in the mess hall, Lieutenant. Kira kept her face neutral. Ma'am, I didn't intend. I'm not criticizing. Vance's voice was measured, professional. I'm observing. In 26 years of service, I've never seen an intelligence officer break cover to deliver a speech about compassion and human dignity. It was either brilliant or catastrophically stupid, and I'm still deciding which. Permission to speak freely, ma'am. Granted. It was both, Kira said quietly. The mission was already compromised the moment Colonel Garrison said my real name. At that point, I had 2 choices. Extract immediately and leave 200 witnesses with questions and rumors, or control the narrative. I chose control. Garrison shifted slightly, his first movement since they'd sat down. The compromise was my error. I take full responsibility. Vance's eyes moved to him sharp. Yes, you do, and we'll discuss that separately. But right now, I'm more interested in what Lieutenant Ashford learned during her 9 months of observation. She tapped the tablet. Your daily reports were thorough, 347 personnel files, behavioral patterns, social networks, security vulnerabilities. But your conclusions regarding Staff Sergeant Brennan contradict the initial intelligence assessment that brought ICA to this base. Because the initial assessment was wrong, Kira said. Sergeant Brennan isn't a recruitment target for foreign intelligence. He's a veteran with untreated PTSD who needs help, not surveillance. And you determined this, how? By watching him for 273 days. By documenting every interaction, every deviation from routine, every indicator that the assessment was looking at symptoms rather than causes. Kira leaned forward slightly. Foreign recruitment targets show specific patterns, unauthorized contacts, sudden financial changes, interest in materials above their clearance level. Brennan showed none of that. What he showed was isolation, hypervigilance, and emotional dysregulation consistent with combat trauma. Vance was quiet for a moment. The intelligence that flagged him came from NSA intercepts, communications between a known foreign handler and someone at this base. I'm aware, ma'am. I reviewed those intercepts. The metadata places the source somewhere in the 3rd Battalion area, which includes Brennan's unit, but it doesn't specify him. The original analysis made an assumption based on his psychological profile, his access to classified material, and his emotional vulnerability. A reasonable assumption. A wrong one, Kira said firmly. I've spent 9 months in that battalion. I've watched everyone with similar access and opportunity, and I can tell you with certainty that Brennan isn't your source. Garrison spoke up. Then who is? Kira turned to look at him. Captain Sloan Walsh, logistics officer, 34 years old, 15 years of service. Impeccable record. No flags in her background check. No financial irregularities. No behavioral red flags. She paused, letting that sink in, which is exactly what made her invisible. Just like I was invisible. She didn't fit the profile of someone who'd commit espionage so nobody was watching her. Vance's expression shifted. That's a serious accusation, Lieutenant. What evidence do you have? Pattern analysis. Captain Walsh has authorized 17 equipment transfers in the past 8 months that technically fall within her scope of responsibility, but show subtle irregularities. Timing coincides with confirmed foreign intelligence activity. Routing goes through contractors that have minimal vetting. The transfers themselves are small enough to avoid triggering automatic reviews. Kira pulled a USB drive from her pocket and slid it across the table. Full documentation, transaction records, communication logs, correlation analysis. It took me 6 months to see the pattern because she's been careful. Very careful, but not perfect. Garrison picked up the drive, examining it. Why didn't you report this earlier? Because I needed to understand why. Kira's voice softened. Anyone can identify a security breach, Colonel. That's basic counterintelligence. But understanding motivation, that's what separates catching a spy from preventing the next one. And what's her motivation? Vance asked. Kira took a breath. Her daughter, Lily Walsh, age 7, diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 18 months ago. Treatment costs have exceeded $400,000. Captain Walsh's insurance covers 80%, but that remaining 20%, that's bankruptcy territory. Her husband left 6 months into the diagnosis. She's alone, drowning in medical debt, watching her daughter undergo chemotherapy while trying to maintain her duties as a logistics officer. The room went very quiet. Foreign intelligence finds people at their breaking point, Kira continued. They don't recruit patriots. They recruit desperate parents and angry victims and lonely souls who feel abandoned by the system they serve. Walsh isn't a traitor by ideology. She's a mother who made an impossible choice when no one else offered her an alternative. Vance's jaw tightened. That doesn't excuse treason. No, ma'am, it doesn't. But it explains it. And if we want to stop the next Captain Walsh, we need to understand the difference. Garrison was reading something on his phone now, his expression hardening. If what you're saying is true, we need to move on this immediately. Walsh could be transferring classified material right now. She is, Kira said calmly. Or rather, she's planning to. Tonight, 2200 hours. There's a shipment of communications equipment leaving the base for contractor refurbishment. Walsh authorized it yesterday, but the equipment includes 3 secure radios that should never leave Fort Carlisle under any circumstances. She's using the contractor or pickup as cover to exfiltrate those radios to her handler. How do you know the timing? Because I've been monitoring her communications for the past 3 weeks. Not officially, not through channels, just watching and listening the same way I watched everyone else. Kira's voice remained steady. I couldn't report it through normal procedures without revealing my cover, and I needed to see the full extent of the operation before making any moves. Vance stood up, began pacing. This is exactly the kind of cowboy intelligence work that gets operations compromised and people killed, Lieutenant. You should have reported the moment you identified Walsh as a potential threat. With respect, ma'am, you're right. Following procedure, I should have reported immediately. But following procedure is also how Brennan got flagged as a spy instead of recognized as a soldier who needed help. Sometimes the rules prevent us from seeing what's actually happening. That's a dangerous philosophy for an intelligence officer. Yes, ma'am, it is. Kira met Vance's eyes without flinching. But so is becoming so focused on threats that we forget the humans behind them. Walsh is committing espionage. She needs to be stopped. But she also needs to be understood. Because there are probably a dozen more soldiers on this base facing similar impossible choices, and if we don't address the underlying conditions, we're just playing whack-a-mole with security breaches. Garrison cleared his throat. That's a conversation for another time. Right now, we need to intercept Walsh's transfer and apprehend her handler. General Vance would recommend we coordinate with FBI counterintelligence for the arrest. No, Ian. The word came from Kira sharp enough to stop the conversation. 3 sets of eyes turned to her. No. Garrison's tone carried a warning. Lieutenant, this isn't a debate. I'm not debating, sir. I'm proposing an alternative. Kira stood up her chair, scraping against concrete. Walsh knows my cover is blown. The mess hall incident is already spreading through the base. She's smart enough to realize that if ISA was here watching Brennan, we might have been watching her too. She's going to accelerate her timeline or abort entirely. All the more reason to move now. All the more reason to let me approach her first. Kira's voice carried absolute certainty. Alone, no backup, no arrest team waiting in the wings. Just me and her having a conversation about mothers and daughters and impossible choices. Vance stopped pacing. You want to give a foreign intelligence asset advance warning? I want to give a desperate mother a chance to make a different choice. There's a difference. The difference is academic when classified material is at stake. Is it? Kira turned to face the general directly. Ma'am, you have a son, Captain Marcus Vance, currently deployed with the 82nd Airborne in Poland. He sends you emails every Sunday that you read during your Monday morning WAFB, even though technically you should be reviewing overnight intelligence reports during that time. Vance's expression went very still, very dangerous. I'm not threatening you, Kira said quickly. I'm making a point. Everyone in this room has something they care about more than regulations. Something that makes them human rather than just a uniform. For you, it's your son. For Walsh, it's her daughter. And maybe, just maybe, if we approach her human to human instead of agent to target, we get a better outcome. Better for whom? For everyone. We get the intel on her handler. We get cooperation instead of resistance. We get a mother who might actually testify against the people who exploited her vulnerability. And we get to prove that the system can show mercy to people who make mistakes under unbearable pressure. Garrison was shaking his head. This violates every protocol in counterintelligence operations. I know, sir. If she runs, we lose both her and the handler. She won't run. She has a 7-year-old daughter undergoing chemotherapy. Running isn't an option. If she's armed, she won't be. Kira's voice softened. Colonel, I've watched her for 9 months. I know how she moves, how she thinks, what keeps her awake at night. She's not a trained intelligence operative. She's a logistics officer who got pushed past her breaking point. I can reach her. I can. The room fell silent again. Vance and Garrison exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation, the kind of wordless communication that came from decades of military service and hard decisions. Finally, Vance spoke. If I authorize this and it goes wrong, your career in ISA is over. Possibly your career in the Army. You understand that? Yes, ma'am. And you're willing to risk that for a woman who's been committing espionage against her own country. Kira thought about the mess hall, about 200 soldiers who'd learned her real name and real rank, about Thorne Brennan's tears and the weight he'd been carrying alone for 12 years, about all the invisible people doing invisible work while struggling with invisible burdens. I'm willing to risk it for the principle that we should try compassion before condemnation, she said quietly. Because if we don't, we become the kind of system that creates people like Walsh in the first place. Vance studied her for a long moment. You're either going to be the best intelligence officer ESA ever produced, or you're going to be drummed out within a year. I genuinely can't tell which. Can it be both, ma'am? Despite everything, Vance's mouth twitched. Almost a smile. Colonel Garrison, what's your assessment? Garrison looked at Kira with an expression that mixed frustration and something that might have been pride. Lieutenant Ashford is the most naturally talented human intelligence operator I've recruited in 30 years. She has instincts that can't be taught and empathy that most officers lose within their first year of field work. She's also stubborn, idealistic, and occasionally shows poor judgment regarding personal safety. That's a yes. That's a she's probably right, and I hate that she's probably right. He sighed. If anyone can talk Walsh into surrendering voluntarily, it's Ashford. But I want full surveillance, audio and visual, and a tactical team within 60 seconds of her position. Agreed, Vance said. She turned back to Kira. You have until 2100 hours to make contact with Captain Walsh. Location of your choosing, but it must be secure. If she refuses to cooperate, if she shows any indication of violence or flight, the arrest proceeds immediately. Clear. Crystal, ma'am. And Lieutenant, this conversation with Walsh is classified at the highest level. Whatever you say to her, whatever promises you make, they don't contradict military law or the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You can offer understanding. You cannot offer immunity. Understood. Vance nodded once sharp and final. Then you have 6 hours. Don't make me regret this. The warehouse district on the eastern edge of Fort Carlisle had been built in the 1970s and slowly abandoned as the Army modernized its logistics systems. Now it was mostly empty buildings waiting for demolition or repurposing home to pigeons and memories, and the occasional private who needed a quiet place to make a phone call away from the barracks. Kira stood in the shadows of Building 7, watching the sunset paint the Virginia sky in shades of orange and purple. Her phone showed 2037 hours, 23 minutes until her meeting with Captain Sloan Walsh, if Walsh came at all. The message had been simple, sent through Walsh's official email with phrasing that looked innocuous to anyone monitoring the account, but would be crystal clear to the recipient. Captain Walsh, this is Lieutenant Ashford. I need to discuss equipment transfer authorization 7734 Part B before it processes tonight. Building 7, warehouse 2100 hours. This is time sensitive regarding your contractor arrangements. Every word carefully chosen. Equipment transfer 7734B didn't exist, which would tip Walsh off that this wasn't a routine inquiry. Time sensitive meant urgent. Contractor arrangements meant Kira knew about the handler. And before it processes tonight meant Walsh still had options, still had choices. If she was smart, she wouldn't come. She'd abort the transfer, disappear into legal counsel, and security procedures make this as difficult as possible. But Kira was betting that Walsh wasn't thinking clearly anymore. That desperation and exhaustion and months of looking at her daughter's suffering had worn away the strategic thinking that made her good at her job. Footsteps on gravel, soft. Kira turned and saw Captain Sloan Walsh emerge from behind a stack of pallets, hands visible, no weapon evident. She was tall blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun, wearing ACUs that looked crisp despite the late hour. Nothing about her appearance suggested espionage or desperation, but her eyes told a different story. Haunted, sleepless. The eyes of someone who'd been drowning slowly and finally felt the water close over her head. They stood 10 feet apart, two women in uniform in an abandoned warehouse while the sun died outside. Lieutenant Ashford, Walsh said. Her voice was steady, but Kira could hear the effort that took. Or is it Private Hayes? I'm having trouble keeping track of who you actually are. Kira is fine. I think we're past the point of formality. Are we? Walsh's hand moved to her pocket. Kira tensed, ready to react, but Walsh only pulled out her phone, held it up. You know they're probably listening to this conversation, recording it, building their case. They are, Kira confirmed. Colonel Garrison has a surveillance team monitoring us right now. If you try to run or attack me, they'll arrest you within 30 seconds. Honest, I appreciate that. Walsh lowered the phone but didn't put it away. So what is this good cop routine you're here to tell me it's not too late to cooperate, to do the right thing, to think about my daughter's future? No, I'm here to tell you I understand. Walsh laughed brittle and sharp. You understand? You're what, 28, 29, single, no kids, entire career ahead of you. What exactly do you understand about my situation? You're right, I don't have children. Can't imagine what you're going through. Kira took a step closer, slow and careful. But I understand being invisible. I understand what it's like when the system you serve doesn't see your pain. When you're screaming inside and everyone around you just sees a functioning soldier who's handling things fine. This isn't the same. No, it's not. What you're facing is worse. A daughter with cancer, a spouse who abandoned you, medical bills that never stop coming. The Army insurance that covers 80% but makes that remaining 20% feel like climbing Everest with no equipment and no support. Walsh's face twitched. You did your research. I've been watching you for 6 months, Sloan. I know you arrive at the office at 05:45 every morning, 30 minutes before anyone else, because that's when you call the hospital to check on Lily's overnight vitals. You eat lunch at your desk because the cafeteria is too loud and you're barely holding it together. You haven't taken leave in 14 months because leave means going home to an empty house that used to have a husband in it. Stop. The word came out strangled. The foreign intelligence handler approached you 11 months ago. Probably seemed like Providence. Someone offering you a solution when you'd run out of options. Enough money to cover Lily's treatment. Enough to stop the collections calls and the second mortgage and the constant terror that you won't be able to afford her next round of chemo. Walsh's hand trembled. The phone nearly fell before she caught it. You can't prove any of that. I can prove all of it. Transaction records, communication logs, correlation analysis between your authorized equipment transfers, and known foreign intelligence activity. I have enough evidence to put you in Leavenworth for 20 years. Then why are we talking? Why not just arrest me? Kira took another step closer. 5 feet between them now. Close enough to see the tears welling in Walsh's eyes. Close enough to see the exact moment her composure started to fracture. Because I wanted to give you a choice, Kira said quietly. Before the tactical team shows up, before the handcuffs and the lawyers and the court-martial, I wanted you to have one moment where someone saw you as a human being instead of a security threat. That's, Walsh's voice broke. That's worse. That's so much worse than just arresting me. I know. Why would you do that? Why would you make this harder? Because easy and right aren't the same thing. Kira held Walsh's gaze. You made a choice 11 months ago. A terrible choice. A choice that betrayed your oath and put classified information in enemy hands. But you made it because you were trying to save your daughter's life. And I need you to understand something important. She paused, making sure Walsh was really hearing her. You're not evil. You're not a traitor by nature or ideology. You're a mother who was put in an impossible position by a system that should have helped you and didn't. And what happened to you could happen to anyone if we push them hard enough. Walsh was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face while her hands clenched around her phone. She's 7 years old. 7. She should be worried about second grade and soccer practice and whether her friends like her. Instead, she's worried about whether mommy can afford her medicine. What kind of country does that to children? An imperfect one, Kira said. A complicated one. A country that asks soldiers to sacrifice everything and then sometimes fails to catch them when they fall. I can't go to prison. Lily needs me. Without me, there's no one. No family, no support system, just social services and foster care, and she couldn't finish, could barely breathe through the tears. Kira moved closer, 3 feet now, within arm's reach. Behind her, she knew Garrison's team was tensing, ready to intervene if this turned violent. But she also knew it wouldn't, knew that Walsh had already made her choice before she walked into this warehouse. Sloan, she said gently, look at me. Walsh raised her head, mascara running face-blotched and broken. You can't change what you've done. The espionage happened. The information was transferred. Those consequences are real and they're coming. But you can choose how this ends. You can run and make it worse for everyone, especially Lily. Or you can cooperate. Tell us everything about your handler. Help us understand the full scope of the operation. And maybe, just maybe, the court-martial board shows leniency because you came forward voluntarily. You can't promise that. No, I can't. I can't promise immunity or a light sentence or anything except that I'll testify on your behalf. I'll tell them exactly what I told you, that you're not a traitor. You're a casualty of a system that failed you. That doesn't excuse what you did, but it explains it. An explanation matters. Walsh was shaking her head, still crying. It won't matter. They'll make an example of me. Female officer caught spying. They'll throw everything at me. Maybe, Kira acknowledged. Or maybe they'll see a mother who made one terrible choice out of love, who cooperated fully when given the chance, who helped prevent further breaches by identifying the entire recruitment network. That's worth something. It has to be worth something. Why do you care? Walsh's voice was barely a whisper. You don't know me. Not really. You watched me, documented me, built your case. Why does it matter to you whether I cooperate or not? Kira thought about the mess hall, about Thorne Brennan's tears, about 347 names she'd learned because she couldn't stop herself from seeing people as people rather than just mission parameters. Because I'm tired of a system that treats empathy like weakness, she said finally. I'm tired of intelligence work that forgets the human in human intelligence. You made a mistake. A huge, consequential, legally devastating mistake. But you're still human. Still someone's mother. Still someone who deserves to be seen completely, not just judged for your worst moment. Walsh closed her eyes, drew a shuddering breath, opened them again. If I cooperate fully, everything I know about the handler and the network, will you make sure Lily's taken care of? That she's not just thrown into foster care with strangers? I'll make sure the Army's family support services are notified. That she's placed with family, if possible, or with the best foster situation available. And I'll personally check on her. Make sure she's not forgotten. You'd do that? Yes. Why, because someone has to, Kira said simply. Someone has to be the person who remembers that behind every security breach and every betrayal and every classified file, there are humans. Real people with real lives who matter beyond their usefulness to the mission. Walsh was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her other pocket, pulled out a USB drive, held it between them. Everything, she said hoarsely. Handlers' contact protocols, meeting schedules, what I've transferred and when, full accounting. I was going to hand this to him tonight, but her voice broke again. But I can't anymore. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep being this person. Kira took the USB drive carefully like it was a live grenade, which in intelligence terms it basically was. You're doing the right thing, she said quietly. The right thing would have been not betraying my country in the first place. The right thing would have been a system that didn't force you to choose between your daughter's life and your oath. But we work with what we have not, what we wish we had. Footsteps behind them. Multiple sets. The arrest team moving in now that Walsh had surrendered evidence. Walsh closed her eyes as the first officer reached her hands, moving to her wrists for the cuffs. Lieutenant Ashford. Yes, tell Lily. Her voice broke completely. Tell her mommy made a mistake, but it was always about keeping her safe. Tell her I love her more than anything in this world. I will, Kira promised. I'll tell her myself. The arrest team led Walsh away, her hands cuffed behind her back, her head down. A captain who'd served 15 years, who'd deployed twice, who'd earned commendations for her logistics work, reduced to a security threat being processed through military justice. But also a mother who'd chosen cooperation over flight, who'd given up her handler and her network because in the end, she still believed in something larger than her own desperation. Kira stood alone in the warehouse holding the USB drive that contained enough information to dismantle a foreign recruitment network and wondered if understanding why people broke was the same as forgiving them for breaking. She suspected it wasn't, but it felt like it should be. Garrison appeared from the shadows, his team behind him, all of them moving with that particular tension that came after a successful operation. That was well done, he said quietly. Better than I expected. She's a good person who made a terrible choice. Those aren't mutually exclusive categories, Lieutenant, though I suspect you know that better than most. He gestured to the USB drive. What do you think we'll find? Everything we need to roll up the handler's operation. Maybe more. Walsh was thorough. It's what made her good at her job. Good enough to betray it. Good enough to save her daughter's life, Kira corrected. There's a difference. Garrison was quiet for a moment. You're going to have trouble in IN if you keep insisting on that distinction. Yes, sir. Good. He almost smiled. As long as you know. They walked out of the warehouse together, leaving behind the ghosts of equipment that had served its purpose and been forgotten. Outside, the Virginia night had settled in completely. Stars visible between passing clouds. Kira thought about Sloan Walsh being processed into detention. About Thorne Brennan hopefully getting the counseling he needed. About 347 soldiers whose names she carried like a sacred text. About what it meant to do intelligence work with your humanity intact. She suspected she'd spend the rest of her career trying to answer that question. But for tonight, she'd helped a desperate mother make a choice that was still bad, but slightly less catastrophic than the alternative. In intelligence work, you took the victories you could get, even the small ones. Especially the small ones. The military courtroom at Fort Bragg was smaller than most people imagined. No dramatic mahogany panels or soaring ceilings. Just government-issue furniture, fluorescent lighting, and the seal of the United States Army hanging behind the judge's bench like a constant reminder of what was at stake. Kira sat in the witness gallery, hands folded in her lap, watching Captain Sloan Walsh face the tribunal that would decide her fate. Walsh wore her dress uniform ribbons still in place, though everyone knew they'd be stripped away before the day ended. Her blonde hair was pulled back severely, emphasizing the hollows under her eyes, the weight she'd lost in the 3 weeks since her arrest. To Walsh's right sat her defense counsel, a JAG officer, who looked fresh out of law school and slightly terrified. To her left, nothing. No family, no husband, no daughter who was still undergoing chemotherapy at Walter Reed while her mother stood trial for espionage. The presiding officer, Colonel Richard Hammett, was reviewing documents with the kind of methodical precision that suggested he'd done this too many times before. 61 years old, 38 years of service with a reputation for being fair, but absolutely inflexible on matters of national security. Kira had spent 2 days reviewing his record, knew he'd presided over 14 court-martials for security violations, knew his average sentence was 12 years, knew he'd only shown leniency twice, both times for junior enlisted who'd been coerced rather than willingly complicit. Walsh didn't fit that profile. She was an officer. She'd made conscious choices over 11 months. She'd accepted payment from foreign intelligence. By every metric that mattered to military justice, she was guilty. The only question was degree. Lieutenant Ashford. Kira looked up. Garrison had appeared beside her, quiet as always. He wore his dress uniform, the rows of ribbons on his chest, telling a story that spanned 4 decades and multiple wars. His face was carefully neutral, but she'd known him long enough to read the concern in the set of his jaw. "Sir, you ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be to testify against someone I convinced to surrender." He sat down beside her, close enough that their conversation wouldn't carry. "Second thoughts. About getting Walsh to cooperate? No. About whether the system will show her any mercy? Yes." "The system isn't designed for mercy, Lieutenant. It's designed for justice." "Those should be the same thing," Kira said quietly. "But they're not, are they?" Before Garrison could respond, Colonel Hammett's voice cut through the courtroom. "This tribunal will come to order. We are convened to determine the guilt or innocence of Captain Sloan Marie Walsh, United States Army, in the matter of espionage, unauthorized disclosure of classified information, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Captain Walsh, do you understand the charges against you?" Walsh stood, her voice steady despite everything. "Yes, sir." "And how do you plead?" A pause. Brief, loaded with the weight of 11 months of choices. "Guilty, sir." The courtroom stirred. Guilty pleas in espionage cases were rare. Most defendants fought to the end, hoping for technicalities or reduced charges. But Walsh had already made her choice in that warehouse 3 weeks ago. She was done running. Hammett nodded, unsurprised. "Very well. Given your plea, we'll proceed directly to sentencing considerations. Prosecution will present evidence of the scope and impact of your actions. Defense will present mitigating factors. Then this tribunal will render judgment." The next 2 hours were clinical. Brutal. The prosecution laid out Walsh's betrayal in excruciating detail. 17 equipment transfers that had put classified communications technology in foreign hands. Intelligence about base security protocols, personnel rosters, operational procedures. Each revelation hit like a hammer. Each piece of evidence, another nail in Walsh's future. The defense tried, presented Walsh's service record, her deployments, her commendations, her daughter's medical records with bills that read like phone numbers. But it all felt insufficient against the magnitude of what she'd done. Then it was Kira's turn. She walked to the witness stand, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom, swore her oath on a Bible that had seen 1,000 testimonies, sat down facing the tribunal with her back straight and her hands steady. The prosecutor approached first a major whose name was Dennison and whose reputation was for crushing defense cases like aluminum cans. "Lieutenant Ashford, you're with the Intelligence Support Activity, correct?" "Yes, sir." "And you conducted a 9-month undercover operation at Fort Carlisle?" "Yes, sir." "During which time you identified Captain Walsh as a security threat?" "I identified her as the source of classified material leaks." "Yes." Dennison's eyes sharpened. "But you didn't report this through official channels immediately, did you, Sonia?" "No, sir." "Why not?" Kira chose her words carefully. "Because identification isn't the same as understanding. I needed to know not just that Captain Walsh was transferring material, but why. Intelligence work without context is just data collection." "That sounds like a rationalization for protocol violations, Lieutenant." "It's an explanation for operational methodology, sir. There's a difference." "Is there?" Dennison moved closer. You observed Captain Walsh committing espionage for 6 months without reporting it. You could argue you were complicit by silence. I could argue that, Kira agreed. Or I could argue that patience allowed me to document the full scope of her handler's network, identify recruitment patterns, and ultimately secure her voluntary cooperation. Which approach serves national security better? Hammett interrupted. Lieutenant Ashford, this isn't a debate. Answer the Major's questions directly. Yes, sir. My apologies. Dennison pressed forward. Did you promise Captain Walsh anything in exchange for her cooperation? No, sir. I told her I couldn't promise immunity or leniency. I only promised to testify truthfully about her circumstances. And what truth do you believe this tribunal needs to hear? Kira met his eyes. That Captain Walsh is guilty of espionage, that her actions compromise national security, that she deserves to be punished under military law, but also that she's a casualty of a system that failed to support her when she needed it most. Oh, failed to support her. Dennison's voice carried derision. The Army provided health insurance, family support services, counseling resources. The Army provided 80% coverage on medical bills that totaled over $400,000. Kira interrupted, which left Captain Walsh with $80,000 in debt. The Army provided counseling services during duty hours, which Walsh couldn't access because she was managing logistics for an entire battalion while single-parenting a child with cancer. The Army provided family support, but that support doesn't pay for experimental treatments or cover the cost of taking leave to be with your daughter during chemotherapy. She paused, letting that sink in. The system provided the minimum. Captain Walsh needed the maximum. That gap is where foreign intelligence lives, in the space between what we promise our soldiers and what we actually deliver. Dennison's jaw tightened. You seem to be arguing that economic hardship justifies treason. No, sir. I'm arguing that understanding why people break is the first step to preventing the next break. Captain Walsh made unforgivable choices, but those choices didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened because a mother was drowning and nobody threw her a rope until it was too late. Your sympathy for the defendant is noted, Lieutenant, but sympathy doesn't change facts. Captain Walsh betrayed her oath. She did, Kira agreed quietly, and she'll pay for that. But if we only punish without understanding, we're not protecting national security. We're just processing casualties after the damage is done. Dennison looked like he wanted to continue, but Hammett raised a hand. Major, I think we've established the witness's perspective. Defense counsel, your witness. The defense attorney stood nervous but determined. Lieutenant Ashford, in your 9 months of observation, did you ever witness Captain Walsh directly endangering lives? No, her transfers were equipment and protocols, not operational intelligence, that would put soldiers in immediate danger. And when you approached her in the warehouse, did she show any resistance to cooperating? No, she surrendered her evidence voluntarily. In your professional assessment, do you believe Captain Walsh would have continued her espionage indefinitely? Kira considered that carefully. No, I believe she was looking for an exit. The emotional cost was destroying her. She just didn't know how to stop without losing everything. Thank you, Lieutenant. No further questions. Kira started to rise, but Hammett's voice stopped her. Lieutenant Ashford, I have a question. She settled back into the chair. Yes, sir. You've painted a sympathetic picture of Captain Walsh, a desperate mother making impossible choices. But you're also an intelligence officer trained to manipulate perception and elicit cooperation. How do we know this testimony isn't just another operation, another way to serve your mission objectives? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Kira took a breath. You don't, sir. You can't. That's the fundamental problem with intelligence work. We operate in deception by necessity, which means everything we say is suspect. Even truth looks like lies when it comes from someone trained to lie. Then why should this tribunal believe anything you've said? Because I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to look at the evidence. Captain Walsh's service record before this incident, her daughter's medical records, the financial documents showing exactly how she got to the breaking point, the USB drive she voluntarily surrendered. All of that is objective, verifiable, true regardless of whether you trust me. She leaned forward slightly. I'm not asking for mercy because I like Captain Walsh. I'm asking for proportional justice because the alternative creates more security threats than it prevents. If we make an example of every soldier who breaks under pressure, we don't get fewer breaches. We get soldiers who are more afraid to ask for help, more desperate, more vulnerable to recruitment. That sounds like a threat, Lieutenant. It's a warning, sir, based on professional analysis. Captain Walsh isn't an outlier. She's a symptom, and if we only treat symptoms while ignoring the disease, we'll be here again in 6 months with a different name in the same story. Hammett studied her for a long moment. You're either very brave or very foolish to lecture a court-martial tribunal on justice, Lieutenant. Probably both, sir. Despite everything, his mouth twitched, almost a smile. Dismissed. The tribunal recessed for deliberation. Kira stepped outside into North Carolina's sunshine that felt wrong, somehow too bright for the heavy thing happening inside those walls. Garrison was waiting by a bench, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered her one without speaking. She took it grateful. Sipped. It was terrible the way all military coffee was terrible, but it was warm and familiar. That was quite a performance, Garrison said finally. It wasn't a performance. That's what made it powerful. He sat down on the bench, gestured for her to join him. You know they're not going to show leniency. I know. Walsh will get at least 10 years, probably more. Dishonorable discharge, felon status, everything. I know, Kira repeated. And you're okay with that? No, she stared into her coffee. But I'm okay with trying, with standing up and saying that she's human, not just a security breach, even if it doesn't change the outcome. Garrison was quiet for a moment. ISA leadership has been reviewing your case. Kira's stomach dropped. And they're concerned. Your methods are unconventional. Your emotional investment in targets raises questions about objectivity. There's talk of reassignment. To where? Training division, teaching recruits, getting you out of field operations. Kira closed her eyes. She'd known this was coming, had felt it building since that mess hall incident 3 weeks ago. But knowing and hearing were different. When, after this case concludes, they want you to develop a curriculum for empathetic intelligence gathering. Make it official doctrine instead of just your personal approach. They want to box it up and make it safe, Kira said. Take what I do naturally and turn it into a checklist. Yes. What if I refuse? Garabison turned to look at her directly. Then you'll be out of ISA within 6 months. They'll find a reason. Failed psych eval, inability to follow orders. Something that sounds official but really means doesn't fit the mold. You're saying I don't have a choice. I'm saying you have limited choices, which is different. He paused. But there's a third option, which is hybrid role, 6 months in field operations, 6 months training. You develop the curriculum but also stay active. Test your methods in real scenarios, then bring those lessons back to teach the next generation. Kira looked at him. That was your idea. It was a collaborative proposal between myself and General Vance. She's impressed with your work despite her concerns. She thinks ISA needs more operators who remember the human cost of intelligence work. And if I take this hybrid role, what happens to my career trajectory? That depends on you. Could be a dead end. Could be the foundation for a new approach to human intelligence that changes how ISA operates for the next 20 years. He shrugged. Most likely something in between. Not a ringing endorsement. I'm 62 years old, Kira. I've seen a lot of talented officers burn out because they cared too much, or stop caring because the system punished them for being human. You're at that inflection point. The choice you make now will define who you are for the rest of your career. Before Kira could respond, the courthouse doors opened. A clerk emerged, calling them back inside. The tribunal had reached its verdict. The courtroom felt smaller on the way back in, heavier, like the walls were pressing closer. Walsh stood at attention as Colonel Hammett returned to the bench, his face revealing nothing. Captain Sloan Marie Walsh, this tribunal has carefully considered all evidence and testimony regarding your actions. The facts are not in dispute. Over a period of 11 months, you knowingly and willfully transferred classified material to a foreign intelligence operative. You accepted payment for this material. You violated your oath as an officer and betrayed the trust placed in you by your country. Walsh's face was pale but steady, ready for the hammer to fall. These actions warrant severe punishment. The prosecution has recommended 20 years confinement, dishonorable discharge, and forfeiture of all pay and allowances. Such a sentence would be justified under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Hammett paused, looking directly at Walsh. However, this tribunal also recognizes circumstances that, while not excusing your actions, provide context. Your daughter's illness, your financial desperation, your voluntary cooperation once confronted, your previously exemplary service record. These factors warrant consideration in sentencing. Kira felt her heart hammering. Beside her, Garrison had gone very still. This tribunal sentences you to 10 years confinement at a military correctional facility with possibility of parole after 5 years pending good behavior. Dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of pay and allowances. Additionally, you will cooperate fully with ongoing counterintelligence operations related to your handler's network. 10 years, not 20, not the maximum, but still a decade of Walsh's life, a decade of her daughter growing up without a mother. Walsh's face crumpled. Whether from relief or despair, Kira couldn't tell. Maybe both. However, Hammett continued, this tribunal also directs that Captain Walsh's daughter, Lily Walsh, be placed in extended family care if possible, with Army Family Services providing oversight and support. Medical costs for Lily's ongoing treatment will be covered by a combination of existing insurance and a discretionary fund for dependents of court-martialed personnel. The courtroom stirred. That was unusual. The Army didn't typically provide for families of convicted traitors. Hammett's eyes moved to Kira just for a second, a flicker of acknowledgement. This tribunal believes that while Captain Walsh must face consequences for her actions, her daughter should not be punished for her mother's mistakes. That distinction matters. He brought his gavel down. This court-martial is concluded. Guards moved to escort Walsh away, but before they reached her, she turned searching the courtroom until her eyes found Kira. Mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Kira nodded once. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't absolution, but it was acknowledgement. Human to human, mother to someone who'd kept her promise. Then Walsh was gone and the courtroom was emptying, and Kira sat there trying to figure out if 10 years for espionage counted as mercy or just slightly less cruelty. 3 weeks passed. The case faded from immediate attention, replaced by other crises and other trials. Kira spent those weeks in meetings with ISA leadership, outlining her hybrid role, defending her methods, arguing for the importance of empathy and intelligence work to people who viewed empathy as a liability. It was exhausting, frustrating, but also necessary. On a Thursday afternoon, she found herself back at Fort Carlisle, walking across the base toward the physical training grounds. The same grounds where she'd run 5-mile formations as Private Hayes, deliberately slow, deliberately forgettable. That life felt like it belonged to someone else now. She was in uniform, full lieutenant insignia visible, and soldiers who'd known her as Hayes did double takes as she passed. Some nodded respectfully. Some looked away, unsure how to process the quiet nobody transforming into someone with authority. The mess hall loomed ahead, its familiar bulk, triggering memories of spilled tea and broken glass and Thorne Brennan's hand connecting with her shoulder. That had been 6 weeks ago. Felt like years. She pushed through the double doors into organized chaos. Lunch service in full swing, 200 conversations competing for audio space, the smell of institutional food mixing with disinfectant and hope. Kira grabbed a tray, moved through the line. Chicken or meatloaf? Some things never changed. She chose the chicken, the potatoes, the beans that had surrendered to their fate, a roll that aspired to breadness, paid at the register. The private working the cash box, different from 6 weeks ago, looked at her rank and straightened slightly. "Ma'am?" "As you were," Kira said automatically. She turned to scan for seating and found Thorne Brennan waving her over to a table where he sat with 3 other soldiers. Her first instinct was to refuse, to find an empty table and maintain professional distance. But something in his expression, open, genuine, not the angry defensive mask he'd worn 6 weeks ago, made her change course. "Sergeant Brennan, Lieutenant Ashford." He gestured to an empty seat. "Join us." She sat. The other 3 soldiers at the table introduced themselves. Specialists and junior NCOs whose names she already knew because she'd learned all their names months ago. They made small talk. Weather, training schedules, the new supply sergeant who was apparently very competent but also terrifying. Normal soldier conversation, the kind that happened in every mess hall, in every military base in the world. But underneath the normalcy, Kira could feel them watching her, measuring, still trying to reconcile Private Hayes with Lieutenant Ashford. Finally, Thorne broke the social dance. I heard Captain Walsh got 10 years. She did. That's less than expected. It is. Did your testimony make the difference? Kira considered how to answer that. Maybe. Or maybe the tribunal decided that context matters. That understanding why people break is part of justice, not opposed to it. One of the specialists, Reynolds, the rancher's daughter from Montana, spoke up. Is it true you're creating a new training program, teaching intelligence officers to be more human? That's part of my assignment, yes. Will it work? Kira smiled slightly. I don't know, but it has to be better than teaching them to only see targets instead of people. Thorne was quiet for a moment, pushing food around his plate. Then I started going to therapy. Real therapy, not just check-the-box counseling, 3 times a week. That's good, Sergeant. It's hard, harder than I thought. Talking about Declan, about Kandahar, about all the stuff I've been carrying. He looked up, meeting her eyes. But it's working. Slowly. I can sleep more than 4 hours now. Don't startle every time something loud happens. That's progress. It's progress because someone finally saw me, he said quietly. Actually saw me. Not as a problem to fix or a threat to manage, but as a human who needed help. Kira felt her throat tighten. You did the work, Sergeant. I just gave you permission to start. That's more than anyone else gave me in 12 years. The table fell silent. Not uncomfortable, but weighted. The kind of silence that came when truth was spoken and needed space to breathe. Then Reynolds cleared her throat. My dad always said the hardest thing about ranching wasn't the work. It was remembering that cattle or living things, not just product. You had to see them as individuals, or you'd treat them wrong. She paused. Guess that's true for soldiers too. It's true for everyone, Kira agreed. We're all someone's Private Hayes, someone they walk past without really seeing. The question is whether we remember that when we have power. Thorne nodded slowly. I forgot. For a long time I forgot. Got so wrapped up in my own pain that everyone else became invisible. And now I'm trying to remember my bum. He looked around the table. Started a peer support group. Veterans talking to veterans about the stuff we're not supposed to talk about. 20 soldiers showed up to the first meeting, 40 to the second. That's incredible. It's necessary, he corrected. Should have existed years ago, but better late than never. They finished eating. The conversation drifted to lighter topics, sports, movies, the eternal debate about which MRE was least terrible. Normal things, human things. When Kira stood to leave, Thorne stood with her, walked her toward the exit. Lieutenant Ashford. Yes. I apologized already, in front of the whole battalion, but I need to say it again, just you and me. What I did was inexcusable. I hit you, in front of witnesses, because I couldn't control my own demons. I know. You could have ruined me, could have pushed for maximum punishment. Instead, you testified that I was worth saving. You were always worth saving, Sergeant. You just couldn't see it. I see it now, and I'm trying to be the person you believed I could be. Kira put a hand on his shoulder, the same shoulder his hand had struck 6 weeks ago. The bruise had faded. The memory hadn't. But memory could be teacher instead of trauma. Keep trying, she said. That's all any of us can do. Keep trying to be better than our worst moments. Even intelligence officers, especially intelligence officers. She left him there, walked out into Virginia sunshine that felt warmer than it had 3 weeks ago in North Carolina. Her phone buzzed. Text from Garrison. First training class starts Monday. 12 recruits. Don't screw it up. She smiled. Type back, no promises. Another buzz. This one from an unknown number. She almost deleted it unread, but something made her check. Lieutenant Ashford, this is Lily Walsh. My grandma helped me write this. Thank you for keeping your promise about my mom. She calls me every week from prison and she says you're the reason she can still talk to me. I'm in 2nd grade now, and my cancer is in remission. Thank you for helping my mom not disappear forever. Kira stood in the middle of the sidewalk reading that message 3 times. 10 years was still 10 years. Walsh would miss most of Lily's childhood. The damage was done and couldn't be undone, but it could be mitigated, softened, made slightly less catastrophic by small acts of mercy embedded in systematic justice. That had to count for something. She typed back, "You're welcome, Lily. Take care of your mom. She loves you very much." Hit send, pocketed the phone, started walking toward the ISA training facility where 12 new recruits were waiting to learn a different way of seeing the world. A way that remembered targets were human, that intelligence work didn't require sacrificing empathy, that the best operators were the ones who stayed human despite every incentive to become cold. It wouldn't be easy. Most of them would resist. Some would wash out. The ones who succeeded would face skepticism from traditional ICA officers who viewed emotion as weakness. But some would get it, would understand that seeing people completely their strengths and weaknesses, their fears and loves, their breaking points and their redemption was the most powerful intelligence tool that existed. Those were the ones who'd change the future. Kira reached the training facility as the sun began its descent toward evening. Inside, 12 faces looked up at her, young, eager, still believing that intelligence work was about secrets and shadows and glory. She'd teach them different, would teach them that the real mission was never about information. It was about understanding, about maintaining humanity in work designed to strip it away, about remembering that every target was someone's daughter or son or parent, that behind every dossier was a human story. Some would call it weakness, softness, liability. Kira called it the future. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice carrying across the training room. "My name is Lieutenant Kira Ashford. For the next 6 months, I'm going to teach you how to be an intelligence officer. But more importantly, I'm going to teach you how to stay human while doing it." 12 faces stared back, skeptical, curious, ready. "Let me start with a story," Kira continued, "about a soldier who disappeared for 9 months, who became invisible in order to see clearly, who learned that the most dangerous threat to national security isn't enemy agents or classified leaks. It's forgetting that everyone involved, targets and operators alike, are humans first." She paused, remembering a mess hall full of witnesses. A captain who chose surrender over flight. A sergeant who chose therapy over anger. A 7-year-old girl whose mother made terrible choices out of desperate love. "The mission always matters," Kira said quietly, "but so do the people. And if you can't hold both truths simultaneously, you'll never be the kind of intelligence officer this country needs." Outside, the sun painted Virginia in shades of gold and amber. Inside, 12 recruits leaned forward, beginning to understand that they were being offered something rare in intelligence work. Permission to care, permission to see, permission to remember that shadows existed because light did too, and sometimes the bravest thing an operator could do was step into that light with their humanity intact. Kira began the lesson, her voice steady, her purpose clear. The mission continued. It always did. But so did hope. So did change. So did the possibility that intelligence work could evolve beyond cold calculation into something that honored both security and soul. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever was. But as Kira looked at those 12 faces, she saw the beginning of something important. Something that might, over years and deployments and difficult choices, transform how America's invisible warriors operated. By remembering that invisibility was a tactic, not an identity. That being a ghost meant you could move unseen. But being human meant you chose when to step into the light. And sometimes that choice made all the difference. The lesson continued late into the evening, those 12 recruits asking questions that had no easy answers. Kira gave them truth instead of comfort, challenge instead of certainty. Because that's what the next generation needed. Not operators who knew all the answers, but operators who asked the right questions, who understood that intelligence wasn't just about knowing, it was about caring what that knowledge meant for the mission, for the country, for the humans on both sides of every operation. Outside, night settled over Fort Carlisle. Inside, something new was being built. One conversation at a time, one lesson at a time, one operator at a time. It was slow work, patient work, the kind that didn't make headlines or earn medals, but it was the work that mattered most. And Kira Ashford, the lieutenant who'd been invisible for 9 months and learned to see because of it, was exactly the right person to lead it. The invisible warrior finally standing in the light she'd always deserved, teaching others to do the same.